Hello, my name's David. I'm a motion designer and director, and welcome to my temporary lockdown pod here in the UK. Now, recently, the folks at Mixamo and Redshift got in touch with me to talk about a really interesting project I did with the guys over at Sky Sports. It was a lovely concept created by art director Liam Pronovich, and as you can see, it involved an awful lot of virtual string.
Oh, what a beauty! Extraordinary effort. Brilliant! Absolutely superb!
So as an accompaniment to that Mixamo Redshift chat, I thought it would be a very nice idea to do a bit of a deep dive video into the processes that I and the team there developed in order to create that work in a reasonably tight time frame. So enough of the old waffle, let's dive into Cinema 4D and take a look at how that was done. Okay, so this is the starting point for this tutorial. Rather than picking apart one of the actual shots that we did for the cricket titles, I thought I'd create something specially for this film, which enabled me to show you how you can do things completely on your own, not with the CG team that we had there, including Nuke compositors. So what I've gone and done is I've created this final sequence, which is this female character who's got some motion capture applied to her, and she's going to end up with this rather dramatic boxing pose. So it's quite a short, simple sequence. But what you're looking at here is pretty much a straight out of the box Redshift render. There's very little compositing involved in this. So it just shows what you can do when you're on your own and you're needing to do things in a little bit more of a DIY fashion. I won't go into too much detail about how this was created because you can apply this string method to absolutely any animating geometry. It doesn't have to be mocap characters, but just so you know, what I did was I uploaded the character as an OBJ to Mixamo, which is something that you have free access to or have access to if you've got a paid Adobe Creative Cloud account. And then I've downloaded 3 different motion capture sequences, the T pose being a static, and then the victory, and then this entry pose as it was called as she walks to the camera, and then I've mixed them together in Cinema 4D to create a slightly longer, more interesting sequence. Now there's actually an interesting and very helpful tutorial on YouTube by Travis Davids about how to do this in Cinema 4D. So if you want to use this as the basis for some of your animation work, then this is really helpful, so I'd recommend that. I'll put a link to it in the film's description. So let's crack on now. Let's get back into Cinema 4D. We've got this animation playing, and I've baked this down. It was done with IK, but I've baked it down to a point cache, which I would recommend doing for your work. It's slightly more reliable, and obviously it speeds up your playback quite considerably, potentially. But the basis for this technique is going to rely firstly on applying string to a static object. This T pose is very helpful for that because it's a nice open position. So if I want to just freeze this position, all I do is disable the point cache in the tag there, and now basically it'll stay where it is all the way through the animation. So that keeps things nice and simple. Now my technique for choice for creating the string is to use the plugin X Particles. I'm sure this can be done with Thinking Particles. It's fairly simple, but this is the plugin that I like to use, the must-have. First thing I always do is turn off that annoying viewport icon, sorry Insidium. And by default it will create this folder structure, which I tend to work from because it's nice for organization. And we've got a default emitter here. So if we just jump across to the final animation again, just to see exactly how it was created, you can see that what's happening as I drag through here, we start off with string growing up from the feet of the character, then they start growing up from the hands and arms, and then finally they start growing down from the hair, and then we get the finished character here. So what's actually happening is we've got 3 separate growth systems, toes, fingers and hair happening. So we want to be able to recreate that here, and unsurprisingly that's going to require 3 emitters in order to do that. So the first thing I'm going to do is start to emit from the hair, for want of a better starting place. So I'm going to call this emitter hair, and I'm just going to work through this in a workflow that I use all the time in X Particles, just to make your visually things a bit clearer here. I almost always assign emitters to groups, even if I don't at the point I do it, realise exactly how I'm going to use that. I like to ring fence behaviours using groups a lot. So I'm going to immediately go to the emitters groups tab, and I'm going to hit create and add group. And I'm also going to change it from a standard to a display only. So it's going to read its speed and radius from the emitter, not from down here, because I find that a bit confusing most often. And I'm also going to change the display to circles so we can see the size, the radius of the emitter particles. So clicking back onto the emitter, the best way to get emission from an object is to go into the object tab and select object emission mode. That's the emitter shape. And then all I need to do is drag my character into the object field here. Now that would mean that it will emit from all over the geometry, and we don't want that. I'm going to just start off emitting from the hair. So in order to do that, I've created 3 polygon selections already here. So it's hair, fingers, and toes. So this is the only place that's going to emit particles, and then they're going to grow around the geometry. Just in case you don't know how to do that, if I go into lasso mode, you can select polygons as you want, go up to the select menu, and then they say set selection, and that will create one of these triangular polygon selection sets. Okay, but I already have my selections made, so I'll just jump back into object mode. I'll select my emitter, and in the selection field here, I can simply drag my hair selection in place, and that now means that particles will only be emitted from the hair polygons. By default, polygon center, that's going to look rather geometric, so I'm going to change it to polygon area, which is a bit more randomized. And that's now basically set up, so I can jump across to my emissions tab. So in my emission tab, I've got a default speed of 150, and I'm going to turn that to 0 because I don't actually want that to be driving the movement of these particles at all. I'm also going to set down the radius. It's a good idea to set it to be something like the width of a piece of string, if that's the effect that you're trying to get, because it does have a bit of an effect on one of the modifiers that we're going to be using. So it can be a bit thicker. If I set it to something like 0.5 radius, that's going to be a centimetre, which is quite a fat piece of string. I could set it down. We'll see how it goes as we run the simulation. But that is now going to be seen because we've got the display set to circle. So we'll see each of those particles as a radius of 0.5 of a centimetre. And if I was to hit play now, you'll see that we've got particles only emitting from the hair, but they're emitting at a rate of 1,000 per second continuously for the whole of time, which is not what we need, because one of the good things about this technique is that you can actually get away with using relatively few particles, so it's quite a light simulation. Just a couple of hundred is actually quite a dense mesh of string when you come to play them out across the geometry. So I can stop emitting them from all frames. You could emit them as a shot in one go, but I found it's quite effective actually if you set them for a few frames. And here I've just set them for 2 seconds, 0 to 60 frames, as this is a 30 FPS sequence. And I'm going to set the birth rate down to something like 150. Again, we might want to tweak that, but it's relatively few. So now if I was to press play, they are appearing for 60 frames, but then the emission will stop at frame 60. And that's all of the string particles that we're going to get. Okay, so now we're ready to start animating things. The string effect itself is going to come from a spline that's going to get generated in the wake of these particles as they move around the geometry. So it's a good idea to set that up straight away, and that's easily done in XParticles. That's under the generator tab here, and it's a particle trail, XP trail. And the way that you get it to work in this instance is as simple as dragging the XP emitter hair into the trail field. I'll name this now just so we know that this is coming from the hair. I'll also just name my group hair group. It's nice to do that. And one other thing I'll do, and you'll see me do this a lot throughout the tutorial, is put numbers at the end. That number means that this is in group 1. I'm going to be doing that to my modifiers as well. I always do that because it makes things much clearer what's being affected by what group as we go along. So now we've got a nice little clear setup here. Now, at the moment, we've got absolutely no movement in the particles, so these trails aren't going to look very interesting. So it's time to start adding modifiers to get these things moving around. And we can get a really effective stringy look here using just 3 modifiers. The first one that we're going to use is going to get the particles moving, and you could do that in many ways, as all things in XParticles, but I'm going to use an XP attractor. Very simple modifier here. Basically, all these arrows are pointing to a spot where all the particles are going to try and get to. So if I was to just hit play now, already we're going to get particles flying downwards with trails behind them going to this point, and then they overshoot and come back. But the whole thing looks a bit of a mess. It's very aggressive. So when I create this sort of effect of trying to get things gently pulled towards something, usually in a tractor, I'll usually set that to just be a simple force, so things don't really accelerate, they just move. And you need to set the numbers quite often right down. The defaults are very aggressive for the attractor modifier here. So now I'm just going to turn off my female geometry for the moment so that we can see the effect that that's had. We get this almost sort of stretchy treacle effect as the particles move downwards, and they're trying to get to this point right in the middle. So it's also probably a good idea just to pull our attractor right down so that they don't ever reach that point while they're on the geometry. So that's a good start. But the next bit we need to do is obviously get the particles to stick to our surface. So for that, we're going to need another modifier, and that is the follow surface. And getting that to work is as simple as dragging our female character into the objects box here. We can set the pull right up. You can set it to 100, but just below 100 means other modifiers will have a little bit more of an effect. So we should notice an instant change here. So here we go. So this is suddenly looking quite interesting very quickly. One of the nice things about using the attractor modifier as opposed to something like gravity is you do get a lot more of this these sidetracked particles. They don't all quite adhere to the direction perfectly. So and this is, I like this sort of stuff. This is a little bit more randomized. So we've already got a very interesting shape that's sticking perfectly to our geometry here. Just zoom in a bit. You can see that we've got this lovely, it looks quite stringy, but it looks very stretched, like it's a wound ball. If that's the effect that you're after, then you could kind of leave it there really, and that's fine. But in my case, because I want this slightly dirty string and to feel like it's a bit more organic in growth, I'm going to add a third modifier, which is XP turbulence, which you put onto almost everything in X particles to create a bit of randomization. And I'm not going to do too much with this. I am going to take the scale of it down a bit. I find that on human scale, the size of the turbulence waves is so big, things can look a bit lumpy. So sometimes you make it much smaller than 25%, but I think this is probably a decent number. So now you can see there's quite a change in the behavior. Some of the particles get stuck at the beginning, some sort of jet off with a bit more speed. So it has a bit more of a randomized impact on the movement. And it's quite a subtle difference, but it just creates a little bit more stuff going on, a bit more wrapping. And it's good. I like it being subtle like that. So that's great. This is a really good basis for our first emitter from the hair. Now, while I'm at it, because I know I'm going to be creating other emitters, I'm just going to think ahead. It's going to have no effect at this point, but I'm going to ring fence these modifiers to this group, this hair group, and I'm going to add the number 1 after them. And this way I know that these first 3 sets of modifiers are all going to be only affecting group 1. It's just good organization and workflow to do this. So now we're starting to get somewhere with our string growth. It's a good point at which to start to visualize this in some sort of rendered form so we can see things with thicknesses and how lighting is affecting the shadows. So I'm going to use Redshift in this instance, which we did also on the Sky job, but now owned by Maxon. It's very well implemented and integrated with hair here, so it's actually quite a simple process. So let's just start by applying some renderable hair to our XP trail here. And the method that I'm going to use in this instance is, rather than applying hair directly to our splines here made by X particles, I'm going to use those to create some guides for a hair object. And a hair object is found under the Simulate tab, Hair Objects, and then we just add hair. And by having the XP trail selected as I create it, it auto-fills the link. It's looking for a spline as a guide basis. And if it wasn't the case, you can just drag and drop in here if that's empty. Now, the first thing that I want to show you is my eternal gotcha that always gets me with hair objects. It's the fact that dynamics is applied by default. If you have that on and you press play, you notice all sorts of weird things start happening, like hair starts dropping under gravity, and it gets very confusing as to what you've done. So I always jump across to dynamics and turn it off. If you're on your own machine, I highly recommend, if you're using a lot of hair objects, to add a blank one, go to the edit tab and set it as default with your dynamics switched off, because then that'll never happen again. But it's got me countless times when I go to other people's systems. So I wanted to show you that. The next step we have here is we go back to the Guides tab and we're going to set these up. By default, the roots are set to spline vertex. Now that means that they grow outwards from each vertex in a straight line, which is why we've got this trippy looking kind of extrusion behind her. Instead, we want these to run along the length of these splines, because we're going to create our hair running down the body. So we set them to spline guides as a root, and they look a bit odd because we haven't got enough segments. We're going to need a lot of segments in this. It's the one thing that's quite heavy in this workflow. But by setting it up to something like 128, the maximum is 1024. It's a limitation of the hair system. But in this case, 128 seems to work. That's 128 segments on each strand going down. So we have these blue guides all set up, and it's this that we're going to actually render to create hair. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to name this, a little bit confusingly, hair, because it's the hair coming from her hair. And when we created that hair object, you notice that we got a default hair material in this window here. It's created it in our material editor. It's slightly unhelpfully coloured for string. It's sort of hair coloured. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create something that's a flat grey at the moment. I'm also going to turn off specularity, and I'm going to reduce its reflectiveness for now. One thing that happens with the integration of C4D hair with Redshift hair is reflections and specular become very hot. They're sort of leery. So you have to turn your numbers right down if you're going to use the settings in this material to control Redshift. And that's possible because it's so tightly integrated with Redshift, you actually don't need to do anything else here to get a starting point for your renderable hair. And we can prove that by going over to my little Redshift interface here. So if I hit play in my render view here, which is my Redshift render view, you're going to see I'm already seeing something. And that's great because I haven't had to even add a Redshift hair material or anything. It's just going to work directly with my hair object. Okay? So we now have a way of visualizing in our real-time renderer. It's one of the great things about Redshift, the thickness and the shading of our hair. Now you can see obviously we've got our female switched on at the moment, the geometry underneath, which we won't see in the final thing, so I can switch her off. You'll also see that the hair is quite thick and stodgy, and the thickness with this workflow is driven by the thickness option, which you can switch on and off in C4D hair. And it works like a piece of hair by default. It goes from thick to thin. But in this case, we want the thickness to be, again, a sort of strings width, which I'm going to set to 0.4, some 0.4, 0.5 of a centimetre. And I want it to be uniform across. So now you can see that we've got a thickness which looks a bit more sort of string-like. You'll also see that it is actually very, very white. And that's partly because I've got the lighting setup I used for the final look. But if I'm just going to pull down the colour for now. And so we're starting to get an idea of how this plays across the geometry. But one thing that you do notice quite quickly, if we go to an area that's quite thickly, densely populated, it's very flat on the surface. It almost looks like a plaster cast across her here. And this isn't creating particularly interesting shadows. It also seems like all of the string is intersecting with itself, which we don't want to give that impression. We're not going to go so deep into creating hair avoidance techniques so that the string actually doesn't intersect, but we don't want it to be quite as obvious as that this is laid flat. And the problem here lies with our follow surface modifier. If I just turn off my render view and go back to the main options for the follow surface, you see we have this offset option, and we haven't touched this yet. So it's offset 0, which means the particles are going to stick tightly to the surface, and there's no variation. So they're all following this plane of each polygon very, very precisely. What we want to have is actually a little bit of variation in that depth, so that some string seems to pass behind other strands of string. So we don't need to change the offset. You can pull it in a little bit if you want a tighter shape, but we can, I think, leave it to 0 here. But we're going to put a little bit of variation. It doesn't need to be a lot. A centimetre is quite a big depth change for string. But I'm going to set that, and now I'm going to go back to the beginning of my sim and I'm going to replay it. You're not going to see too much effect here because all we're looking at is splines visualized in the viewport. If I stop on what looks like a reasonably interesting frame, so we've got our hair constantly updating, so that's good. And so if I hit play again, now we're going to see we've got a lot more depth variation, and it's quite a dramatic change to the effect. You can see we've lost that plaster of Paris effect. We can see shading, shadows between the strands as they sit on top of each other, and that's much more what we're looking for. And see, from a little distance away, it actually looks quite string-like already, even though we haven't really applied proper string. There's just a thick hair running down each strand here. So you can actually use this technique if you're doing distance shots, which we did on the Sky job for one of the shots, because it didn't really need anything more complicated than that. So you can see that we've actually got something that's pretty interesting here. And what you might think at this point is, okay, wow, this is great. This is looking awesome. Let's actually turn on our animation again, and let's see how it grows with the animated geometry. But we're going to run into a problem. So I'm going to turn her back on so you can see her moving. And I'm going to go back to frame 0 and reactivate my point cache. And then I'm just going to play the simulation again. Now, initially, because she's in this static T pose, it looks okay. But then she does her victory pose and the problems start to arise. You can see that the particles are sticking to her even as she animates. But those trails behind her have lost all reference to the geometry. The splines are just made and then left behind. And so if we now have a look at the render here, it's actually, I'll turn her off again. It's actually quite an interesting effect. You might want to explore that as a form of sort of recorded movement over time, but it's not the effect that we're after here, trying to get our growing string on a character. So I wanted to show you that now because it certainly stumped a few of us at the beginning of the R&D into this pipeline as to how to get around this problem, and you actually have to be quite devious about it to go around this, and we're going to explore that as we go on in the tutorial. But for now, suffice to say that we can work with creating all of our base string on a static object. So I'll disable that point cache. We're going to grow all three of those systems, from the hair, the fingers and the toes, on our T pose, and then we're going to worry about animating it all afterwards, okay? So all I need to do to capture the XP trail splines in the position that we need to create our final growth effect is to simply play the simulation through to a frame that I think they look interesting enough in their final state. Imagine that they're now fully grown, and then we just need to freeze that. So I'm going to play this on maybe to something like this. We don't need the arms and the feet and the legs to be visualized yet because we've got separate emitters coming from those. So if we said that this frame 139 was quite an interesting frame, I can right click my XP trail and say current state to object. This is something I do so often. You see I've actually created a button for it here, but what this has done now is it's locked that final state into position. So I often use the word frozen afterwards so I don't get confused, but I do know it came from the XP trail hair if I ever need to go back and resim. What you may even want to do is type the frame number which you've stopped it at, just in case you need to go back and grab that frame again from a sim. But now we've got this final state. The hair object can have this applied to it. And now when we go back to frame 0, it's been locked into place. And that's actually the basis for our final growth effect that we're going to create a bit later. So all I need to do now is recreate this exact same process for the other two emitters from the fingers and the toes. And as it's so similar, it's a bit boring. So let's fast forward through to the end of that and take it from there. So here we are with our final X-Particles XP trail growth splines in place and frozen into these three different spline objects. And so now we've got these applied to our hair objects. We don't need X-Particles from here on in. It's played its part. You can see that in the end I created three groups. I used that numbering system and they did their job, and the XP trails drew out, and then I just captured them into these frozen splines here. And if we just actually hit render, you'll see actually I'm working off quite an old machine here, so this isn't the most powerful graphics card and CPU, but we've already got a fairly fast version of our render here so that we can now test things as we get into the animation phase. So it's already looking quite interesting, a bit mummy-like. But I think really at this point we should really take a sip of tea. Okay, a good start. But now we need to tackle that thorny issue of how to get this growth system working on animated geometry. So here we are back with our fully grown string on our body from our 3 separate emitters, which has created these 3 spline objects for the hair, the fingers and the toes. So how do we go about actually making this work on animated geometry? The process is remarkably simple. We've now parked X particles completely. That part of the workflow is over, so I can switch off that whole system, so nothing is being calculated. And I've pulled everything out that we need for this part of the tutorial, the hair objects and the splines, out under a null called fast string. This is not the exact system we're going to use at the end, but it's a system which is very quick for working on timings of animation and the string growth. So for the purposes of speed, I'm going to switch off 2 of the hair objects. We might as well switch off the splines in the viewport as well, because we can see how this animation process works first on a single spline object. This is the one that was emitted from the hair. It's an extremely simple thing to do. All you need to know about is the surface deformer. I'm holding down Shift while I've got my spline object selected, and that means it's going to become a child automatically, and that's what's going to make it work. And all we need to do to have this follow our geometry is make sure we're at the same frame that we froze the geometry to grow string on. In this case, that is frame 0. But if it's not, if it's somewhere in the middle of your animation that you froze, then you need to make a note of that frame and go there, because we need to initialize this surface deformer on a kind of base position. So I've dragged the geometry of the female clothed character into my surface, and I'm going to hit the initialize button, and we're going to stick with the standard projection type. This will work very well because we know that all of our splines and particles are stuck very closely to that geometry, so the projection should work absolutely fine. And it stores it in memory. That takes up a little bit of memory, but not too much in this case. And what we'll find when we hit the play button now with our cache re-enabled, so now the animation is happening. If I just switch my character on for now so you can see the whole thing, she's going to go through that victory pose, and miraculously here, you see that now our splines are actually following the geometry. So it really is as simple as that. And it works extremely well with this. I've not really had any problems with the geometry deviating, as long as you've got your animation cached. If it's IK based, we did get some gremlins seemingly happen on a random basis where it would start leaving the geometry. But with point caches, it's pretty rock solid. So there you go. It's a trick that you can apply to all sorts of different uses. It's really pretty amazing deformer, that. So all I'm doing here is I'm just duplicating it to the other 2 splines now. I'm going to hit initialize on that frame 0, that T-pose again. You have to do this each time for each of your splines because they're different. And now if I press play, we should get our full animation. It's a little bit slower with the all 3 systems activated and a hair object, but you can see that it is following. So if we go to a frame where she's actually taking a step, and now if I hit the render view here, you can see we've got this lovely effect going on here, and that the difference between the depths of the different pieces of string that we got using the follow surface modifier really stands out here. We've got this lovely shading and shadowing, so that's great. And of course, an advantage of using this workflow for creating the animation is we don't have to re-sim X particles every time we want to jump to a frame. We can jump backwards and forwards to whichever frame we want, and the deformer will catch everything up. So that is one of the major advantages of getting rid of the X particles aspect of the setup once you've got it to grow the string as needed. So in terms of creating our final basic setup of animation here, we just need to understand how to get this string to grow backwards and forwards. And that is equally simple as learning the surface deformer. You simply have to understand one of the really great features of the hair material itself is the length option, and that's off by default, but if we check it on, we get a tab over here, and you can see that we have a 100% length setting here. Now at the moment we have the same material applied to all 3 emitters spline objects. And so if we change this setting here from 100 to say 0, what you're going to find is that the string disappears completely, because that same percentage is being applied to all three hair objects. If we set it up to 10%, you'll see that things start to appear. So growing the string really is as simple as just pushing up that slider. Now we have a variation amount here. This is quite useful for randomizing the position of the growth, so you don't get a kind of wave front of string. But this is going to be used in a slightly different way at the end, so I'm actually going to set that down. I mean, we can set it off for now, but this is going to have a different effect, as we'll see later in the tutorial when we come to apply high resolution string. So all we need to do to get the string to animate over time is to keyframe this length setting. But we do want to have separate control over the different emitters. If we just jump across to the final animation again, you see that obviously over time that foot emitter started first, and you can just see the finger emitter starting, and the hair emitter doesn't start till much nearer to the end. So if we want to have that control, we do need to create duplicates of our hair material and apply them. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'll call this hair mat hair, so we'll stick with that as the hair material. Then I'll duplicate that and call it fingers. And then I'll duplicate that and I will call that toes, or F-toes. There we go. And then I'll drag toes onto toes, hair onto the fingers. And now, if I put my render view back on again and I go to length, I can separately control my different emitters' length settings. Oh, have I still got that on? Mat hair mat toes. No, that's correct. Okay, 25%, 39%, and let's say 60% toes. So there you go. So you can keyframe each of these separately to get control. Now, the only compromise that there is with this way of doing the growth is that for each emitter, all of the particles, or the string, will appear to start growing at the same time. So if we, for instance, come up to the hair and we select our hair material, we go to 0 and make it disappear, you can see that if we just go up to 0.1, which I did, by the way, by holding the Alt key down and hitting the arrow up, which is a 1/10 increments, you can see that we do get this blobby effect. Now, that was a little bit visible in the final piece, so if I had my time again, I would probably hide that a bit by not having it in camera. You can see they all appear from the fingers there, and then we also see they just suddenly appear from the hair. I wouldn't do that again. I would probably hide that in a transition or something. And you might want to separate some of the strands out into separate emitters as well, if you needed to get a little bit more of a graduated effect. Obviously with X particles we had that rate setting on, and so they wouldn't all appear like that. So it is a subtle difference between emission using X particles and then this system where we get this sudden appearance of everything. So just bear that in mind. It's really the only compromise I can think of. Everything else just works beautifully. And of course, another great advantage is it's so simple and so easily keyframeable that it's also much more tweakable. So if I went back to my production take, I'm going to turn off my render view for now. We can play with the stage object, and we can very quickly determine where we think we're going to need, our growth patterns to start depending on the camera view, and then we can instantly tweak them without having to do any resimming or recaching of anything. So that really is a massive boon to your workflow, because I would estimate probably changed each shot in the Sky Cricket titles sort of 24 times on professional jobs. The never-ending tweaks that are needed to timings and to camera shots and things like that it knows no bounds. So having something that's just responsive to update and also to get quick preview renders from like this, is great, because although this isn't going to be the final string effect, it's good enough for doing quite high quality animatics, certainly for getting sign off. So it really is a good workflow in a pro environment, as well as being very good if you're just doing stuff for fun yourself. So that really is the bulk of the animation work done. All that remains is to work on the final look of the string so it looks really great, particularly on those close-up shots where it's going to be quite exposed. So now we understand the growth and animation aspects of this string animation. all that remains for us to do is to create this final look as something like we've got here. Now, it doesn't take an awful lot of research into string to understand that in fact there are many different types of string, so it's probably a good idea to get some reference of the specific look you're after. But there are really two things that define the cliche of string. The first is that string is usually made up of some sort of fibre that's twisted together in multiple groups. You can see in all of these here, you can make out more individual strands, and these are twisted. It's called twining, which is why string is sometimes referred to as twine. And so that's a very distinctive look, which is useful to recreate if you want people to think that they're seeing the illusion of string. The second thing that you tend to always get in string is a type of stray. That's fibres that get pulled away or cut and don't conform perfectly to the edge. And that roughness is going to add greatly to the realism. You can see here we've got lots and lots of strays. This is a very rough form of twine, as we've got here as well. The more high quality, the fewer strays you're probably going to get. But that stray look is actually quite useful to us in helping sell the illusion, and you can definitely see that in the final piece. It's quite subtle. I haven't gone overboard. It's mostly where you see light catching it, but it's definitely there, and you would certainly notice it if it wasn't. So the look that I was going for is a fairly rough looking string. In the sky job we went for very matte, so very much like a twine, because that's the look of string inside a cricket ball. Here I've gone for something that's got a little bit more sheen to it, so it feels a little bit more silky, so it's more of a kind of hybrid between a high quality and low quality string. But I thought that the way it caught the light was quite interesting. So all that remains for us really now is to go into Cinema 4D and see how we could recreate that effect using the simplest possible method. So here I have a very simple demonstrator scene consisting initially of just this one spline object, and this is a parametric helix which is available under the splines menu here. This gives you lots of options, and I've set this up to look like maybe a piece of twisted string. So we've got a very narrow radius of 0.15 centimeters. That's the looping width. It's only 50 centimeters long. That's kind of a good starting point. And so what we need to do to turn this into the first part of our cliche of string is to create two further copies of these and then just spin them around their axis. So if I hold down the control key and make two copies of this, and then I select the first one and I'm going to bank it 120 degrees, the next one 240 degrees, and then the third one, our initial one, is 360 degrees. So that's a full loop. And so we've got something that looks like a reasonable starting point for our string. Now, the first thing I would say about this is we don't really want to be working with parametric objects in the end, because this is going to be duplicated hundreds of times and they are quite heavy. So what I would want to do once I've got my primitive helix here is I want to freeze this down to a simpler single spline object. So I'm going to select the null that these are all under, and I'm going to right click and I'm going to say current state to object. Then I'm going to middle mouse click the duplicated spline and I'm going to say connect objects and delete. And it's this that we're going to use as our primitive. If we have a look in points mode, you can see the number of points on this, and I've kept this very low. This is determined by the subdivisions in the parametric helix, and we want to again keep these as low as we can get away with because they're going to be duplicated thousands of times. So we want to keep this as light as possible. So that looks like a reasonable resolution, not very high, but you couldn't really notice from a distance. So with this created, it is this helix object that ultimately is going to take the hair materials. So we're going to create a hair object out of this, which now is a process we're probably quite familiar with. We select the spline, we go to simulate hair objects, add hair. First thing I do is switch my dynamics off if it's not off by default. And then we come over to guides. Again, the guides look wrong because they're not set to be spline guides, and we need to set enough segments that now the guides run along this helix. So that is actually now the basis for our final production string. So we can jump over to our Redshift view here. And if I hit my render view, you'll see we've got a rather strange material. It's currently applied the default material that it creates when we make a hair object. I've got the hair material that we made during the earlier parts of this tutorial, so I'm just going to replace that by dragging it on top of the tag. And what you can see is we have these very chunky looking, almost kind of boxes being extruded along the line of the helix. And that's because our thickness was set in the earlier parts of the tutorial to express the entire width of a piece of string down the paths that our XP trails made. But from here on in, we want these hair fibers to represent individual strands of string that then get twisted together to form the final shape. And those, of course, are very fine. So we can set these right down to somewhere around this figure 0.03. They can be much thinner than this, say even 0.01, or a bit thicker, depending on the type of string you're looking to create. But as you can see, we're currently only seeing one strand of hair running along each of the helixes, so we've got massive gaps in between. So what we want to do is we want to be able to fill out these holes with multiple copies of these strands of hair to get a richer looking hair material. And that's not done in the hair material, that's done in the hair object over here. So we have the guides at the moment, and there's only 3 of them, that's one for each of the helixes. But in the hairs tab here, this is where the actual hairs get made that we see in the render. And if we go down to this sub-menu here, cloning, we see at the moment they're set to 0, but we have the opportunity to create clones here of these original strands. Now, the cloning system makes things much faster to render, but it does slow down the pre-processing. So the more of these we create, the longer it takes the render to get going, but it's still relatively fast to work with. So it's the system that we probably should be using. I'm going to start off with, say, 15 clones. And you'll see something a little bit crazy happen. They get spread out all over the place. And that's because the root setting here is telling us that we want 5 centimeters between our original hair guide and the furthest out clone. And that's way, way too much. We're probably looking at something half or less than the entire width of the string. So something like 0.2 of a centimeter, root and tip. And now you can see that we're getting something that looks a little bit like string. I might even want to go, say, to 0.15. And what we can do is also put a little bit of variation. This is just going to roughen up the position forwards and backwards of the string along its path. So we want to set this very low, even something like 0.5% just breaks up this pattern. And you might notice that the colours of these strands are slightly different from each other. And that's something that's in the colour tab of the hair material. Although we only have one colour set here, I've got some variation settings here, and the one that's most important is this V value, which is brightness. If I set that down to 0, all of my hair fibres will be the same colour, and it's quite a subtle difference, but if I set it up to 100%, you'd see a big difference. And the basic rule of thumb is that the more variation you have in their brightness, the more grungy and rougher and possibly cheaper the string is going to look. So you probably want to keep these values fairly low, and it's almost subliminal. You wouldn't notice that there's a big variation, but it is there if you took it away. Okay, so here we now have quite a reasonable basis for our string cliche. But we obviously don't want the string to be in a straight line. We want it to follow the paths of those grown strands that we made using the XP trails. So the next part of the process is that we need to spline wrap this around those paths. The spline wrap is a deformer. So if I select my primitive and I hold down the Shift key and go up to my deformers menu, and then I go around for 10 minutes trying to find the one I want again, and then I arrive at spline wrap, then that will become a child. And now what we need to do is we need to make it follow a spline in this spline link field here. So I'm going to activate my spline for wrapping ×1 and drop that in there. It's going to go a bit crazy because our original our helix triple is running down the Z axis, so it was running down the wrong axis. And now if we just find where that path was for spline wrapping, here we have a very simple path with our triple helix running along it. So that's great. That's kind of the look we want. What I will say here is it's worth trying to roughly match your primitive, your triple helix's length to the lengths of your path splines that you want. Obviously, they'll all be quite different with XP trails, but there'll be a kind of an average. And the way that you find out, if you don't know this, the length of a spline is you select it, we go to Mode, Project Info, and Structure, and you'll find that it tells you the spline length. And here, it's almost 59 centimeters. Our triple helix, if I go to the coordinates tab, you can see is 50 centimeters. So it's not quite the same, but it's good enough. And what that allows us to do is to keep the mode of our spline wrap to fit spline. That's going to stretch or squash the spline it's applied to fit the path. And we don't want it to be doing too much of that. Otherwise, it's going to make our triple helix look weird, like a spring if it's really tight, or it's not even going to look like a triple helix if it's too stretched. But by having this fit spline option, it's always going to be ultimately the full length of the paths that we've made, which is a better starting point. So this is looking great. And what we can obviously now do is if we go to our hair material and we go to the length tab, you'll see that if we pull this down, we're getting the string growth effect that we had in the earlier parts of the tutorial, but now we're getting it with a triple helix rather than that simple single cylinder. And what you'll also notice is that this leading edge is looking quite nice and soft and randomized. And that's because of this variation. So the variation now in our hair material is applying different amounts of length slightly to each of the hair fibers. Now we have multiple clones of them. If I set that to 0, we get this very sharp edge at the front, which you might want. And as we put the value up, then we start to get a bit more randomization. Now, this figure that works for you depends on the length of your paths because it's a percentage of that. So there's not really a one size fits all. We actually found with the very long strands that we were creating in our X Particles sims, we only wanted variations of about 1%. Otherwise, it got quite ragged for quite a long period at the front of the growth. So you need to tweak that, but it's a good feature to have because it just softens that front edge and makes it feel a little bit more organic. So although it looks like we've now done that part of the string making process, I'm going to ruin your day by saying there's actually a gotcha here. And this took quite a while to figure out the best solution for this. And we can't see the problem until we start using a spline that's made up of multiple segments for our spline wrap. In this case, the one we've used is spline for wrapping times 1. We've only got one single segment. But if I look at this spline, which we've created, we have 3 segments here. And this is much closer analogy to the situation that we have with our XP Trails, where we have potentially hundreds of these separate segments, but all squashed down into one object. So if I select my spline wrap and I drag the spline for wrapping times 3 in here, and I go to my hair object, even if I try to regrow it in the guides tab here, because it may just be not updating, you'll see that the hair snaps back to simply following the original triple helix shape, which was a straight line. You can see that the actual spline wrap appears to work fine. The splines themselves are okay, but it just doesn't render in the viewport. And the problem with this, I'm not quite sure of the technical reasons for it, but we've got a spline being wrapped around multiple splines. So we're effectively creating multiple copies of that spline. And it doesn't seem to like that, the hair system, unless we compress them all down into what's called a connect object. And this is the Swiss Army tool for squashing parametric objects and making Cinema 4D think that they're just sort of frozen final versions of geometry. And we can make a connect object simply by selecting our triple helix primitive, holding the Alt key, coming up to this generators menu, and then I go to the connect. By default, it has weld switched on, which will weld points in a certain radius, but I'm going to switch that off. We don't want any welding to happen. So now we have a connect object, which is behaving exactly the same. It doesn't seem to do anything. But what we can now do in the guides tab here is I can drag the connect in here as opposed to the original spline. And miraculously, now we have 3 triple helixes being wrapped around. So this is the final setup that you're going to need for your main strands of hair. You are going to need to involve a connect object. The slight downside is that they do slow things down a bit in the viewport. They're slightly heavier to work with, which you do really start to notice when we've got hundreds of strands. But it's still workable and usable, and there's not really any other way around that I found to make this work. So the last thing that we need to do in order to really sell the look of this string is to create some stray fibers that have managed to find their way off of the main path of the string. Here I have an image that created as part of the R&D for the original job. It's a ball of string, and if they're pointed out, you can see these strays just pulling away here. They're fairly short and they taper off, and you almost wouldn't notice them. But that's a really important aspect of the subtle details that sell the reality of a shot, is they almost look too subtle for any human to have bothered to have manufactured them. That really makes the eye think, oh, they must be real, because who would have bothered to do that? So I use that in my mind quite a lot as a rule for whether something's worth making or not. And in this case, definitely yes. So how do we go about doing that? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to need another hair system which has slightly different settings to this, but that they're going to be quite closely related. And we're going to find another gotcha, but the first thing that you might think to do is to apply either to this connect object, this triple helix, or more efficiently to the paths that define the length of the string. So we can do that again the same way as normal. I'm going to select my ×3 wrapper here, go to simulate, add hair. It's going to make another hair object. I'll just pull this up. I'm going to switch my dynamics off. And it's going to look a bit crazy because it's got the wrong settings. So at the moment we have one guide coming out of every vertex. A more flexible system is to say spline uniform. And at the moment they're all 100 centimeters, and that's way too long. I'm going to set them down to 2 centimeters, which is possibly also slightly too long, but it helps us see them more effectively in the viewport. This still looks pretty strange, and part of that is we see they're all sticking in one direction. So under this growth menu here, we can set that to be random. And you notice nothing happens. I found with this particular hair system for strays, you often have to hit the regrow button down here, and it just forces an update. So now they look a lot more randomized. The reason they look crazy in the viewport is because our hair for strays has again created a default hair material. But I have a material that we made as part of the R&D for our previous projects here. So I'm just going to replace that. And we're going to see something that looks, well, certainly a lot more organic. But it looks strangely clumpy. And to understand that, you need to know that the guides is not the same as the hairs. The idea behind guides is to create visual feedback in the viewport that's as efficient and light as possible so that the viewport is responsive. But then, obviously, with a hair system, you want millions of copies sometimes of those hairs to make things feel populated, a head of hair or grass. And so the actual final rendered hair is controlled here. And by default, the roots are set to be automatic, which is more for a hair or a grassy system. If we set them to be as guides, then we're just going to get one strand for every guide. It's going to use the guides as the exact position for a single strand of the hair. And now you can see that we have something that looks quite a bit more stray-like. So if we just quickly look at the stray's material, you can see I've set the thickness to be the same as all of the other fibres in the main string because they are those fibres. But we've got this curve set, this is the root, and then they're curving down to the tip, so they taper. They don't do that, they look just a bit chunky and a bit ugly. So tapering them off just refines them down a bit. And we've also added a bit of kink and a bit of bend. Now you can play with all the various options. We have lots of them here: frizz, clumping, curling, waving, twisting. There's a lot of different ways to randomize the hair here, but it will rely in your guides on the number of segments. So if you only have one segment, there's nothing. There's not enough segments to curl. So your viewport doesn't change, but you do need enough segments for the final render to be able to create a curl. Obviously, the more segments, again, the heavier it gets. So you do want to kind of keep it to the minimum possible to sell the effect. Now, as I said, I've made these a little bit too long, but it's so that it's easier to see in this tutorial. You might want to kind of halve the length of those so they're a bit more subtle. And you can play with the quantity to your heart's content. The more you get, you may have to hit regrow. There you go again. This is something you have to do quite a lot. I would say that's probably too many. So the number here is dependent entirely on the length of your string and the effect that you're trying to create. But we're getting somewhere now with this stray system. However, there's a problem. remember that ultimately we need this system to be able to grow and shrink, because that's the growth effect that we're looking for. And that at the moment is being done through the length tab of our main strands of hair, which I've left at 81 from a few minutes ago. If I pull out, you'll see that obviously we can grow those main strands, but those strays, well, they just stay where they are because they're forever the full length of the path. And that is clearly not the effect that we want. So trying to figure out how to create a system that will grow both the hair fibers and the strays was quite a bit more complicated, but it's not too bad once you know how. So let's explain this final part of the process so that we can create a rather lovely system for being able to animate the full system of hair to look like a piece of string growing or shrinking. What I will just do for my sanity, and you know that I do this a lot, I'm just going to define string and strays so that we know which one is which. And it turns out that we can't really just use this spline as the growth basis for our stray fibers, because there's no real way of getting that to tie in with the length of the string as it grows in the hair material. But there is a way of doing it if we had some geometry with a texture mapped onto it, and we can animate a texture to tell the strays to shrink or grow. Now we'll see the detail of that in a second, but let's set the system up to start with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my spline for wrapping times 3. I'm not going to move it around too much, so what I'm just going to do is create an instance of it, which just means that we can leave that where it is. I'm just going to drag the instance up here. And I'm going to make a sweep out of it. That's going to be a shape that follows the path but is made of actual geometry. So by holding the Alt key and going up to these generators here, I can make a sweep which becomes the parent. If I hold down Shift now and I go to end side, that's going to become a child, and this is a sweep system. It looks ridiculous because the diameter of my default end side is huge. So let me just set this right down to say 0.1. I can also set the size as low as possible. Again, we want to keep this very light. We just need some geometry. We don't need to have lots of facets. And what I'm also going to do is I'm just going to turn this off to none, so it's actually 3 points. I'm also going to go to my spline wrapping times 3, and I'm going to change its intermediate points to uniform. The reason for that is we're going to be dealing with percentages along this spline, and a lot of the tags and deformers, when they work with percentages in the length of an object, they see the distance between 2 points as always the same percentage, even if in geometry they're miles apart. And this can create an accelerating and decelerating effect as you pull percentage sliders up and down, which we don't want. So I've set this to be uniform. It won't change the look of it if you set the segments high enough, but we'll leave those as they are for now because we'll take them as red. And that's obviously then going to affect my instance. So this has now got uniform segments. So we have a sweep, and we have some UVs on this sweep now because we've got geometry. Now we can't see them, there's no tag, but they are in there. So how can we use that? Well, what we need to do is now make this sweep the generator for our strays rather than the path. And I can do that by dragging the sweep into my link field. I'm going to regrow them again. We have different sets of root options here because this is now polygons, not vertices. So I'm going to set this to be polygon area. That's randomly assigned across the whole surface. I'm going to regrow them again. And you can see quite quickly we're almost back to where we started. But what we can do now is take advantage of another aspect of the length tab here in our strays material. Now we've already looked at growing string using the length, and we've looked at variation and amount here. But sometimes you want to grow string an even length, but you want it to be excluded from certain parts of geometry. And that's what this texture field is down here. So perhaps a simpler analogy would be to imagine a landscape where you want grass to grow across it, but you don't want it to grow everywhere across the landscape. And in this example, I've just used a simple checkerboard. The black squares represent where we don't want grass, and the white squares represent where we do. And so by applying that to this texture channel, that is then mapped across the UV coordinates of the geometry, and we get grass in some places and not in others. So in this example where we're using a sweep, I could add a gradient to this texture channel, which is going to be mapped along the length of the sweep. And if I go into edit it here, I think it's the V coordinates that we want running down the length. And I have a black and white here. I'm going to need to switch these around so that they're like this. But if I shift select these knots and then drag them backwards and forwards, you can see we're affecting in the render view here where the strays are growing. At the moment, they're only growing at the beginning. And as I pull the gradient knots forward, it grows further and further down the sweep until here it's actually starting to grow beyond where our main string strands are. So this is a really clever way for us to get control over where strays grow and they don't. So I could simply keyframe the position of these gradient knots so that they coincided exactly where I was keyframing the length of my string. That would be the old-fashioned way of doing it. But a much sexier and a more professional way of doing it would be to connect these knot positions together with that length setting we've got in our main string. And that is the one that we then only have to control alone, and the strays would catch up. Now that's possible, but the only way that we can actually do that is by using Expresso. And I know quite a lot of you are intimidated by Expresso, so I'm not going to go through the process of making it, but we're going to jump forward to see it having already been made, just to walk you through exactly what's happening in the calculations. And so maybe you can implement that yourself in your own ways. But just before I do that, I'm going to switch off the sweep to the camera and the render, because we don't actually need to see that geometry anymore, because it's doing its job simply by controlling the position of the strays. So just quickly, here I have my final Expresso set up. I've applied an Expresso tag to my strays hair object, although it could actually go anywhere. And I've got my main string material driving with the length setting two range mappers, which simply allow my points of the gradient, the knots, to be slightly separated, and then they're going into the position of each of the gradient knots here. So you can see this in arrow means that these are now being driven. And so with just the one controller, my main string's length function, I can now pull back the string, and the strays never deviate, they never go over the end of the string, but they do grow out as that string gets longer. So there you go. That really is the nuts and bolts of the process. But I just want to do one final part that tackles with some of the issues with Redshift hair materials specifically. So you may want to skip that bit if Redshift is not your renderer. But there's some important workflow things to consider which might speed up the way that you work when creating your final production scenes. So here I have my final production scene that was used to create that little sequence with the boxing lady, and everything in here is stuff that you've already seen. There's nothing new. But what I have done is I've created a little Expresso rig here so that I can access all of the controls that we've seen throughout the tutorial in one simple interface. So for instance, I can animate the hair length here instead of having to dive through loads of different hair materials. But I have here 4 systems. We have the hair, the fingers and the toes. And I've also created one final system where I've just pulled out a few strands that are always switched on. They don't grow. It's just to define the shape a bit better, which you can see in the final piece. There's always about 3 strands. But otherwise, that's it. We have these 4 separate systems, each with their separate hair materials and separate controls so that we can grow them individually. But what you will find when you get into quite final systems like this with heavy geometry is they do get quite slow. And one of the main bugbears that you'll have with the final rendering of this string is the first frame of every animation, or if it's a still, will take forever to process at the beginning. For instance, if I try to activate my render view here and I press play, basically John Travolta comes up. I don't know if that's just my system or you're all seeing that, but sometimes he can be on screen for minutes at a time. And in the corner it says extracting geometry. If you're doing a picture viewer render, it will say processing, and you'll see no progress bar, and it could take quite a few minutes to get going. On the positive side, that is only going to happen on the first frame. So if it's an animation, don't get terrified that you're going to have to multiply the time that took by every single frame. But to avoid that whole problem, I've created this much simplified scene here using a ball of string, which is not a bad primitive to test hair materials on, and also some simplified lighting, but with similar lighting powers to my final production scene. So it should give me a pretty good impression of what we're looking at when I hit the render button. So with that said, here I've actually got two versions of my string ball. I've got one set up with our animatic setup with hair objects with just one thick strand representing each piece of string. That's called my fast string. And I've got a layer for that here. And then I've created a final string. So if I wanted to up the ante a little bit, I can turn off my fast string, turn on my production string, and you see this has got the triple helixes. So this is a little bit more representative of my final look, and so I really can test whether my lighting and my material settings are working with this. So if I just jump back to my fast string for a second to keep things super responsive, as we've seen throughout this tutorial so far, I've only been working with the C4D hair materials, and that's been rendering fine with Redshift. But if you're particularly familiar with the Redshift channels and would like to be using Redshift hair, that's perfectly easy to do. All we do is go up to the material editor, create Redshift, and then under the submenus here, we've got a hair material. Now, if I was to drag this Redshift material onto my fast string hair object, you'll see we've actually got two materials here now, a C4D and a Redshift hair material, and absolutely nothing changes. And that's because if we take a look at the shader graph for our Redshift hair, which is hidden with such limited real estate here, I've got my Redshift hair node, but by default that's connected to a node called C4D hair attributes. And so with this double material setup here, I've actually got everything being piped directly straight into Redshift hair, and it renders exactly the same. In fact, that's kind of what's happening anyway when we don't have a Redshift hair material. There's a kind of invisible Redshift hair node being fed all of the data. But if you want to control certain aspects of your material using Redshift instead of the C4D hair, you can do that by unlocking these various channels by disconnecting the ports. So for instance, if I disconnect internal reflection and diffuse from the hair material, which is this color channel here, we now get control back in the Redshift shader graph, and in this case it's a slightly orangey color. But something weird will happen if I turn my normal C4D hair material into a funky green. You can see that this is still having some sort of effect on our Redshift material. Now, the reasons for that are, in the C4D hair material, we have this illumination tab, and we have a translucence setting. Now, super confusingly, that relates to this output here, which isn't called quite the same thing, and that's a bit of a weird thing with these outputs. They're not always named particularly intuitively and identically to their attributes in the attribute editor. So if I was to turn translucence down, that color would disappear. But if I wanted control over that using Redshift, I'd obviously want to disconnect this port here and also the translucency color. Now, at the moment, there isn't a translucency color. It's just reading color. That is actually this backlit color. And now you see when I switch this on, because I'm telling C4D hair to force this blue color, the translucency changes color. So we get this very confusing and complicated relationship between the C4D hair and the Redshift hair. So what I would recommend for this reason is that you either work entirely with the Redshift hair attributes in the shader graph, or you work entirely with a C4D hair material attributes and don't change these ports here. Now, you can work entirely with Redshift hair by going into the shader graph and deleting this node. This will then change quite dramatically because every channel in the Redshift material becomes unlocked. What you shouldn't do, if I just undo that, is think that you're going to be working only with Redshift by deleting the material tag for C4D. If I do that, you'll see that the thickness changes, and that's because there are other attributes other than shading that are being read through from the hair material. And as you know, we've got this hair thickness and also the hair length being driven by these tabs here, and we've got length switched off in that particular material, but that was where we were controlling our string growth. So you do not want to be deleting your C4D here. The only way you can control things like length and thickness without that is to right-click your hair object, go to your Redshift tags, and you'll find that there's a curve tab. It auto-detects that it's on a hair material, and then you've got more control. But I would recommend using the C4D system for what we've been doing with length and thickness, because it's so simple and it works so nicely. So do not delete the material tag in the object list. Delete simply the node in the shader graph to get control of your materials entirely through Redshift. So the last thing that I just want to talk to you about in the Redshift material settings is a little bit about that translucency, that backlit color. So the easiest way for me to do that is just to kind of backtrack on what I've done by accessing our final string here with a triple helix. And I've just turned off all the color settings again, so we're back to sort of where we were with a neutral color. If I want to have this transmissive color, I can use my backlit color in C4D. Now that's going to be the same as the transmission settings if you're only using Redshift hair. So you can see here we've got this blue color. And one thing that we did in this demonstrator, the boxing girl, is and my translucency being 100%, so remember that needs to be up. If we look at the final frame of that, you can see that we've got this backlight. And what it looks as if we've got a red light behind the character here. But in reality, that light was not red, it was actually a plain colour, and none of the lights in our scene have a colour. And so by applying a transmissive colour instead of using coloured light, it gives us a more neutral look regardless of the angles that we're at. So here we've got a fill light in the background here, and that's also not coloured. I'll just prove to it here. This is the fill, it's a white colour. The rim light, that's white, and a key light. But regardless of how the thing is lit, we're still getting this backlit effect, which is a very important part of the mood for the lighting. So it just means that we're not tied to very specific angles for our lighting to look great, or our colours, if something like a transmission colour is an important part of the look and the mood of the piece. It's not realistic because obviously in a real piece of string, its actual diffuse colour and its internal reflection colour would almost certainly be the same colour that you'd see if it was backlit. But this little trick here, it just allows you to retain the mood regardless of the angle of your camera and your lighting. And that frees you up to do more dynamic things without worrying about relighting or having to put in keyframes for moving lights around. Okay, so that's my final tip when it comes to creating material settings. You can, we've obviously done that here with the C4D hair, but you could have done that just as easily in the Redshift hair shader graph. So there you go, that just about wraps it up for this video. You've got all the information you need to create perfect looking string. And if any of you go away and do stuff inspired by this, I'd really love to hear about it. So don't forget to use @MeshMashUK on either Twitter or Instagram to let me know, and feel free to email me with any more questions and corrections if I've done anything wrong here or you think there's other ways that it could be done better. So that's it for now, and I hope to see you again in the future, and good luck with your work. Take care. Bye.